The first time my ex-husband touched my wheelchair in 10 years, he was not helping me. He was blocking my way to the courthouse elevator with his body while whispering, "Sign the custody settlement, Mara, or I'll tell everyone what really happened the night you ended up in that chair." For half a second, I could not breathe, not because I was afraid of him, but because after 10 years of calling the accident a tragedy, Adrian Blackwell had just admitted there was something he had buried. I did not know it yet, but that whisper would become the last mistake he ever made in court. Our son was standing behind him. "Dad," Oliver said quietly. "What did you just say?" Adrian froze. The hallway outside Family Courtroom 3 went silent. I could hear the small click of my wheelchair break under my thumb. Adrian turned slowly. His gray suit looked perfect, as always, but his face had gone tight around the mouth. His wife, Sloane, stood near the security desk with her phone in one hand. She did not speak. She just watched, eyes moving between us, as if she was already deciding which version of this moment would be safest to repeat. Adrian recovered first. "Ollie," he said softly, "your mother misunderstood." Oliver did not move. He was 12, tall for his age, with his father's dark hair and my habit of staring too long when something did not make sense. "What night?" he asked. "This isn't the place," Adrian said. "You were talking about Mom." My attorney, Priya Nair, stepped out of the courtroom at that exact moment. She was calm in a way that made aggressive men careful. She looked at Adrian's hand on the armrest of my wheelchair. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "remove your hand." Adrian smiled for the security camera. "Of course. I was only making sure Mara was all right." "I'm fine," I said. His eyes moved to mine. That had always been the problem. I was not supposed to be fine. I was supposed to be grateful. Quiet, easy to pity. A woman in a wheelchair with a sad past and a soft voice. For 10 years, Adrian had depended on that. 10 years earlier, I woke up in a hospital bed unable to feel my legs. My first clear memory was a doctor leaning over me, saying my name. I tried to answer, but my mouth felt full of sand. "Your son is safe," he said. That was the only sentence that mattered. Oliver had been too, strapped into the back seat, when a delivery truck ran the red light and crushed the passenger side of our car. I remembered glass, metal folding inward, Adrian shouting, and one small thing that made no sense for years. A buzz. Not a ringtone, not music, just the quick vibration of a phone against plastic. I remembered glancing toward the cup holder. I remembered Adrian's hand dropping, then headlights, then his shout. Then I turned in my seat to reach Oliver. Then nothing. 2 hours after I woke, they let me hold my son. He slept against my chest, a small bandage above one eyebrow. I cried without making a sound. Adrian stood at the foot of the bed. He was 32 then, handsome in the polished way that made strangers trust him. A real estate developer. A man who remembered names at charity events and forgot promises at home. "He's okay," I said. Adrian nodded. Instead of saying it back, he looked at my legs under the blanket. What exactly did the doctors say? His phone was in his left hand, the screen cracked across one corner. When it lit up, he turned it face down on the windowsill. That evening, a police officer asked routine questions. "The truck ran it," Adrian said before the officer finished. "Our light was green. Were you distracted?" "No." The answer came too fast. I was too medicated to care. I only remember Adrian sliding the phone into his jacket pocket and looking at me. "You don't remember much, do you?" At the time, I thought he was worried about my head injury. Now I know he was measuring what I could prove. It took him 17 days to leave. First he stopped sleeping in the hospital room, then he stopped bringing Oliver during visiting hours. Then he missed my first rehabilitation meeting for an urgent client dinner. On day 17, he arrived with a blue folder and a coffee he hadn't bought for me. "I spoke to someone," he said. "An attorney." I was practicing a transfer from the bed to the wheelchair, arms shaking, sweat at my temples. I had nearly died, and I was embarrassed that my husband saw me struggling. My physical therapist looked at me. I told her it was okay. She left. Adrian set the folder on the bed. "I can't do this. This life." I looked at the wheelchair, then at him. This is my life now, Adrian. I know. No, you don't. His jaw tightened. His the place reality always interrupted the story he preferred. I'm not built for hospitals and ramps and all of this, he said. I didn't ask you to be built for it. I asked you to stay. He pushed the folder closer. I think Oliver should stay with me while you recover. Every muscle in my body went cold. No. Mara, be realistic. I am being realistic. I'm his mother. You can barely get out of bed. And you can barely look at me. That hit him. For 1 second he looked ashamed. Then the shame hardened into something else. I don't want to fight. I want what's best for Oliver. No, you want what's easiest for Adrian. He picked up the folder. Fine, we'll do this your way. For now. That sentence stayed with me for a decade. The divorce came quietly because I was too tired to make it loud. My sister Celeste, a nurse, loud, fiercely organized, allergic to male self-pity, moved in for 6 months. My father built the ramp to my front door himself. My mother filled the freezer with meals labeled in blue marker. My therapist taught me how to move through the world without apologizing to the furniture. And Oliver grew. He grew while I learned to shower sitting down, to drive with hand controls, to notice strangers talking to whoever stood beside my wheelchair, instead of to me, even when I was the one paying. He grew while Adrian sent child support by automatic transfer and birthday gifts through his assistant. A silver train set at 4, a remote control helicopter at 6, a tablet at 8. Never a card written in his own hand. When Adrian called, it was usually because his mother had reminded him. 3 questions, same order, every time. How's school? Being good for your mom. Still building little robots. Then, that's great, buddy. Whether Oliver had answered or not. Why doesn't Dad come to Pancakes Day? Oliver asked once, when he was small. He had work. Why does he call me buddy like he forgot my name? That one broke me. I never told him his father was good. I never gave him my anger to carry either. Some people love the idea of being a parent, I said when he was 7, but they don't always know how to do the work. Do you think he'll learn? I don't know. Did you? I brushed his hair back. Every day, I went back to work part-time as a grant writer for a nonprofit that designed accessible housing. Oliver did homework under my desk, or built little machines from spare parts. By 9, he could fix a jammed printer faster than half the office. By 10, he was building cardboard elevators for his action figures. Because everybody deserves access. By 11, he won the state junior robotics championship with a device he called StepMate, a low-cost sensor that warned wheelchair users when a ramp was too steep or unstable. That was when Adrian remembered he had a son. The first sign wasn't a phone call. It was a photograph. I opened Facebook one evening and saw Adrian smiling beside Oliver at the award ceremony, cropped so I wasn't visible in the corner, clapping from my chair. The caption read, "Proud father moment. Watching Oliver grow into a brilliant young man has been the honor of my life." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Celeste looked over my shoulder. "Oh, absolutely not. Don't comment," I said. I wasn't going to comment. I was going to commit a felony. Within an hour, the post had hundreds of likes. The comments came fast. "Great job raising him. Like father, like son." Oliver saw it the next morning, holding his cereal bowl. Why did Dad say he raised me? Because sometimes adults tell stories that make them look better. Should I say something? Do you want to? He shook his head. No. It feels gross. It should have ended there. But Adrian had tasted applause. 2 weeks later, he called. "I'd like to see Oliver more." "Why?" "He's my son." That didn't answer my question. I don't need to justify wanting a relationship with my child. "No," I said. "But you do need to explain why you discovered that desire the same month he won a public award. That's unfair." "So was cropping me out of the photo." He sighed. "I know you've done your best, but Oliver is getting older. He needs more than you can give him alone. Private school, travel, connections, a bigger world. He has a world. He has your world." That was the first sentence that truly scared me, not because it was loud, because it sounded reasonable enough for strangers to believe. "He needs his father," Adrian said. "Then become one. Courts don't always look kindly on a parent who interferes. You're threatening custody? I'm saying maybe it's time to revisit what's best for Oliver. The petition arrived 11 days later. Adrian Blackwell, requesting primary physical custody, citing my limited mobility, unresolved trauma, financial instability, and a pattern of alienating the minor child from his father. Priya listened without interrupting. Do you still have everything? Every missed visit, every unanswered email, every time he chose not to show up. Yes, I said. I think I do. Good, she said. Because men like Adrian don't lose when you call them cruel. They lose when you prove they were absent. That sounded simple. It was not, because Adrian did not come back like a monster. He came back like a reasonable father, with a perfect house, a patient voice, and a lawyer who knew how to make absence sound like misunderstanding. His first move was at school. Adrian appeared on a Thursday afternoon in a navy blazer, Sloane beside him carrying gluten-free cookies in a white box, as if snacks made an ambush less of an ambush. Mara, the school secretary whispered into the phone, Oliver's father is here. Is he on the approved pickup list? Listed as a parent, not approved for unscheduled pickup. Then he does not leave with my son. By the time I arrived, Adrian was kneeling in front of Oliver in the office lobby. Oliver looked cornered. Relief crossed his face the second he saw me, and Sloane noticed it. Oliver has robotics practice, I said. You didn't tell me. You didn't ask. Mara, we really don't want conflict, Sloane said, one hand on her heart. Then stop arriving unannounced. Adrian turned to the secretary with a sad little smile. You see what I'm dealing with. She didn't smile back. I see a student who has practice in 10 minutes. Oliver stepped behind my chair. Adrian saw it. That night, his attorney filed an emergency concern, stating Oliver appeared fearful and overly dependent around me. Priya read it over video call and smiled faintly. He used the school office? Good. They have cameras. I thought that would end it. It didn't. At the temporary hearing, Adrian's attorney, Blake Voss, didn't argue like a villain. He argued like a reasonable man asking reasonable questions. Why hadn't I encouraged more contact? Why was Oliver so anxious around his father? Why had he stepped behind my chair? Blake played 10 seconds of the school footage, not the whole scene, just Oliver stepping behind me. Priya objected. Judge Maribel Stone allowed it. For the first time, I watched Priya misjudge a room. She had the full video ready, but the short clip had already done its damage. It made Oliver look afraid of his father, and made me look like the place he hid. Judge Stone didn't grant primary custody, but she granted Adrian structured Saturday visits, unsupervised, for 6 weeks. Outside the courtroom, I said, You said the cameras would help. They still might, Priya said quietly. Not today. That was Adrian's first real win, and it changed everything. For 6 weeks, every Saturday felt like handing my son to a man who had learned how to smile for judges. The first visit lasted 3 hours. Oliver came home quiet. He showed me the room, he finally said. At dinner. At his house. For me. What's it like? Nice. Too nice. Like a hotel pretending to be my bedroom. The second Saturday, Adrian didn't take him home at all. He drove Oliver 40 minutes to Ashbourne Preparatory, a private school with a robotics lab that looked like something from a university brochure. Gleaming 3D printers, a wall of trophies, a teacher who shook Oliver's hand like he was already enrolled. Oliver came back holding a glossy folder he hadn't asked for. What's this? Dad says they have a robotics team that goes to nationals every year. He already talked to the admissions guy. Oliver turned the folder over in his hands like it weighed more than paper. He showed me my room again, too. He put up a shelf. For trophies I don't have yet. What did you say? Nothing. I didn't know what to say. He paused. Then he asked if I liked it more than my room here. What did you say? I said I liked Bolt better than the shelf. I almost laughed. Almost. Because underneath it, my stomach had gone tight in a way I recognized. The same tightness from the hospital bed, the same tightness from the blue folder. Adrian had never needed to say, "Come live with me." He only needed to make the alternative look small. He asked one more thing, Oliver said, quieter now. He said, Wouldn't it be easier if you lived here? Not mean. Just, like it was obvious. What did you tell him? I said easier for who? I reached for his hand. Good answer. He didn't really answer back, Oliver said. He just smiled like I'd said something cute. That was the part that frightened me most. Not the school, not the shelf. The smile, the one that took a 12-year-old's pushback and filed it away as something to outgrow. The next week, through the court-approved app, Adrian wrote, Oliver seemed withdrawn after returning to you. I am concerned he feels guilty enjoying time with me. I wrote back, Oliver is adjusting. Please keep communication focused on logistics. Adrian replied, that is exactly what concerns me. He knew how to make restraint look cold. And I understood something that scared me more than his anger. If Adrian kept winning small, he wouldn't need one big lie. He would build a record out of tiny doubts. Then came the message from Sloane's phone. Oliver brought it to me holding the screen like it had bitten him. I know your mom gets upset when you love me, but you don't have to feel bad. Soon you'll have a room here too. You'll finally get to be a normal kid. Am I not normal? Oliver asked. You are normal. That word was meant to make you doubt your life. Priya filed the message. Adrian claimed Sloane only meant less pressure, more room to grow. Judge Stone ordered all communication with Oliver through the monitored app. Adrian didn't protest. That was what made him dangerous. He always knew when to stop looking unreasonable. His next move wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork. A request for my health records, arguing my condition affected my parenting. Blake asked careful questions about pain, medication, independence, whether I had ever cried in front of my son. Then he brought up the 5th-grade camping trip, a school trip with no accessible cabins, which Oliver had skipped because, he'd said, it didn't feel right without me volunteering like the other parents. Blake used that one story to suggest my condition had narrowed Oliver's childhood. It worked more than I wanted to admit. That night, Oliver found me crying in the kitchen. I'm sorry. The camping trip. I didn't want to go, he said, frowning. I wanted them to build a ramp. I had no answer for that. The custody evaluator, Dr. Samuel Keene, was quiet and neither warm nor cold. At Adrian's house, wide staircase, glass railings, a staged bedroom with navy bedding, and unopened science kits arranged like a catalog, he used the words opportunity and stability over and over. At my house, with its scuffed floors, adaptive counters, and a kitchen table covered in soldering tools, he watched Oliver step over a half-built robot near the couch. This is Bolt, Oliver explained. What does Bolt do? Mostly fall over. Is that a design flaw? Oliver considered it. More like a personality. Dr. Keene smiled. The visit went well, and that frightened me more than drama would have, because ordinary is harder to defend. When he interviewed Oliver privately, I waited in the parking lot with my hands locked on the steering controls. Oliver came out pale. He asked if I help you a lot, he said. I said sometimes. Like, I help reach the cereal when Grandpa puts it too high, and you help with my homework. Then he asked if I felt like I had to choose. What did you say? He looked out the window. I said Dad makes it feel that way. The report came 2 weeks later. Priya read it silently, then looked up. He recommends Oliver remain with you. Supervised visitation for Adrian, unless Oliver asks for more. She kept reading. He also says Adrian appears focused on correcting the story of his absence, rather than repairing the relationship. I cried. Not loudly, just enough to let 10 years leave my body for a minute. Adrian fought it anyway, hiring an expert who had never met Oliver, never visited my home, never spoken to a single teacher, to suggest my disability had turned my son into a caregiver. Priya dismantled him in under a minute. The judge let the report stand in the record but gave it almost no weight. Adrian didn't lose that day. Not completely. That was what kept the room tense. For every truth we found, he found a way to make it sound like opinion. 3 days after Oliver's 12th birthday, First Harbor Bank called. Ms. Whitmore, we need to confirm whether you authorized a proposed change to the Oliver Whitmore Education Trust. No. The trust, set up by my grandmother, was the one thing meant to carry Oliver through college. I was sole trustee until he turned 18. We received a draft request naming Mr. Adrian Blackwell as co-trustee. The officer said, in the event of your incapacity. My what? Priya pulled the documents. The request hadn't been completed. That mattered legally. But emotionally, it told me everything. Adrian hadn't forged my signature. He was smarter than that. He'd stitched together old medical language, old divorce filings, and the new custody claims to argue that if I was too limited to manage Oliver's future, he should help. It wasn't about the money. It was about replacing me on paper before he replaced me in our son's life. Blake called it responsible planning. Priya called it strategic pressure. But this time, even she underestimated him. This is unpleasant, but not fatal, she said, tapping the folder. He didn't take money. The court may see it as overreach, not misconduct. At the next hearing, Blake said it almost word for word. My client did not steal, did not forge, did not withdraw funds. He merely asked whether a contingency should exist if Miss Whitmore's physical limitations worsened. Discomfort is not evidence of bad faith. It landed. Not hard enough to win, but enough to muddy the floor. Afterward, Priya closed her briefcase too sharply. I should have known he'd make everything sound reasonable. It was the first time I'd seen her angry at herself. It scared me. It also made me trust her more. Perfect people are usually performing too. By then, I was no longer afraid Adrian might win, because people believed he was kind. I was afraid he might win because people believed he was reasonable. The next truth came from a man I hadn't spoken to in 10 years. Evan Rusk had been Adrian's best friend before the accident, driving behind us that night. He'd disappeared from our lives afterward, and for 10 years I assumed he'd simply chosen Adrian. I was wrong. He'd chosen shame. He met us in Priya's office on a rainy Monday, a baseball cap turning over and over in his hands. Mara, I'm sorry. I didn't answer. That night, after the crash, you were unconscious. Adrian got out first. Oliver was crying. I ran up to the car. Adrian kept saying, "The light was green, the light was green." But before impact, I saw him looking down. At his phone? Priya asked. Evan nodded. The old buzzing sound came back so clearly I felt it in my teeth. The truck ran the red light, he said quickly. That part's true. It caused the crash. But Adrian saw it late. He grabbed the wheel. The car turned. Your side took the impact. I told him we should tell the police. He said it wouldn't change anything, except make insurance harder. He said you'd need the settlement. He said if I cared about you and Oliver, I'd keep it simple. Why now? I asked. His eyes filled. Because he called me last week. Asked if I remembered whether you reached for the wheel. He wanted you to blame me. He didn't say it that directly. He never does. For years, the phone had been a half memory, a faint buzz inside a broken moment. Now it had weight. Adrian hadn't caused the truck to run the light, but he had shaped what happened in the second after, then spent 10 years letting me carry the consequences, and now he wanted to use those consequences against me. Adrian asked for mediation the next day. Priya advised caution. He's losing. That makes him careful, not harmless. We met in a conference room with beige walls and a mediator who looked like he'd chosen the wrong decade to retire. Adrian arrived without Sloane. That worried me more than if she'd come. For almost a minute, he said nothing. Then he leaned forward. I'll withdraw the request for primary custody. Priya didn't react. In exchange for shared legal custody, Ashbourne for Oliver, joint oversight of the education trust, and a written statement that I was never kept from him. I stared at him. That last part is what you really want. He looked wounded. I want my son. You want the past rewritten. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what it's like to be treated like the villain in your own child's life. I almost laughed. No, Adrian. I understand exactly what it feels like to be trapped inside someone else's story. His voice lowered. Think carefully. If this goes to trial, the accident comes out. I met his eyes. Good. For a moment, he looked genuinely tired. Not angry, not smug, just tired. Mara, he said, quieter now. I was scared. I saw you in that hospital bed, and I didn't know how to live with what happened. He looked down at the table. I tell myself I left because I couldn't handle the chair. But sometimes I think I left because every time I looked at you, I saw the car. I didn't answer right away. It was the closest Adrian had ever come to honesty, and some old, tired part of me almost reached for it, almost said I know, almost let 10 years soften into something we could share, instead of something he'd done to me alone. Then he ruined it. "But I am here now," he said, "and you still won't let me fix anything." I looked at him for a long moment. "You're not trying to fix what you broke. You're trying to control what survived." He blinked, like the sentence had cost him something. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him, not for what he'd lost, but for how hard he was working to avoid knowing what he'd done. A braver man would have stayed in that honest sentence about the car. Adrian couldn't live there for more than a few seconds. He needed the room to think he was still the one being wronged. The human moment disappeared. The negotiator returned. "Then I'll see you in court," I said. 2 days before trial, Adrian's side filed a supplemental statement implying that I may have reached toward the steering wheel during the crash, that my memory was unreliable, and that Oliver's loyalty to me was built partly on guilt. It was not as crude as an accusation. That was what made it dangerous. It gave the judge a shadow and asked her to imagine the monster. That night, Oliver knocked on my bedroom door. "Mom?" I closed the folder too late. He saw the old accident photos. His face went pale. "Is that you?" "Yes." "Why do they have those?" "Because court can be ugly." He sat on the edge of the bed. "Dad thinks you grabbed the wheel. He wants people to wonder." Oliver was quiet for a long time. "I don't remember the crash," he finally said. "I remember after. You in the chair, Grandpa building the ramp, Aunt Celeste yelling at the toaster, you crying when you thought I was asleep." My throat closed. "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "I also remember pancakes, and Bolt, and you clapping too loud at my science fair." He smiled through it. "You told me I was embarrassing." "You were." His eyes filled. "But you were there." By then, I no longer needed the court to believe I was perfect. I only needed it to see him clearly. Trial began on a Monday. Full courtroom, no shouting, no reporters, just tired faces, and people pretending not to stare at me. Adrian's business partners sat behind him, Sloane in cream silk, hands folded. My family sat behind me, Celeste closest. Oliver sat beside the child advocate, Ms. Bell. Blake opened gently, not calling me unfit, but limited, not calling Adrian absent, but newly available, not calling Oliver a prize, but a child who deserved more. Priya stood without raising her voice. "This case is not about whether Mr. Blackwell may become part of his son's life. It is about whether he may take control of that life after 10 years of choosing not to share it." Mrs. Alvarez, the school secretary, testified first. "Who handled school matters?" "Ms. Whitmore." "Who attended conferences?" "Ms. Whitmore." "Who did Oliver ask for when he was sick?" She looked at me. "His mom." Simple. Better than a speech. Dr. Keene followed. Blake raised the word parentification. "I saw a boy who helps at home sometimes," Keene said. "That is not the same as a boy being used as a caregiver." Asked if Oliver had seemed distressed during the interview, he said yes. Distressed at being asked to agree that his childhood was lacking. Then Evan took the stand and told the room everything he'd told us in Priya's office. The phone, the wheel, the request to keep it simple, the call last week trying to make my memory look unreliable. Blake came at him hard. "You had financial problems at the time?" "Yes." "You'd been drinking earlier that day?" "1 beer." "You waited 10 years to come forward. Why should anyone believe you now?" Evan looked at the judge. "Because I should have said it then. No dramatic line, just shame." It was enough. Priya introduced the old texts, recovered, against all odds, from a backup on Evan's ex-wife's storage bin laptop. "Don't mention the phone. Insurance gets messy if they think I was distracted. And, 20 minutes later, she won't remember. Keep it clean." Adrian's face didn't show fear. It showed rage. He whispered something to Blake. Blake whispered back, sharp. Sloane stopped blinking. The trust officer confirmed the rest in under 5 minutes. Adrian had tried to name himself co-trustee using my medical history, and the custody filing as support. He hadn't taken money. He hadn't completed the change. He had tried to position himself as the safer adult. On paper, before the court, before he'd done a single day of the work. Then came Oliver. I hadn't wanted him to testify. He asked to anyway. "I want Dad to hear me," he said. He walked to the stand in the blue shirt he hated because collars felt like traps. "Oliver," Blake said carefully, "do you love your father?" Oliver looked at Adrian. "I don't really know him enough." A small sound moved through the room. "Do you want to know him?" "Yes, but not like this. I wanted him to come to my stuff. I didn't want to move into his house because I won a trophy." "Do you feel your mother made it hard for you to have a relationship with him?" "No," Oliver said. "She made excuses for him. A lot. That hurt more because it was simple." Priya asked her only question. "Oliver, what do you want the court to understand?" He gripped the edge of the stand. "My mom uses a wheelchair. Some stuff is harder. But my life with her is not sad. She came to my science fairs. She knows my teachers. She lets me build robots on the kitchen table, even when I mess it up." He looked at his father. "You keep saying I need more. Maybe I did, but what I needed was you. I don't want to live with him. I just want him to stop acting like I'm something he can win." That was the moment the case ended, even though the judge hadn't ruled yet. Adrian knew it, so he finally said what he meant. Mara put those words in his mouth. He snapped, standing. "Sit down," Blake said, grabbing his sleeve. Adrian pulled away. "She's had 10 years to make me the villain." "I took him?" I said. "You made him need you." Oliver's eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "No, you left us alone." The silence after that was absolute. Judge Stone called a recess. It was during that recess that the story returned to the hallway. Except this time, the security camera was already running, and the boy who had asked, "What did you just say?" was standing close enough to hear every word. When court resumed, Priya asked to submit the hallway footage and call the security officer. There was no audio. The video showed Adrian stepping in front of my chair, his hand on the armrest, his body blocking my way to the elevator, and Oliver behind him, suddenly still. "I couldn't hear every word," the officer testified, "but I heard enough to know Mr. Blackwell was pressuring her." The boy repeated the sentence right after. "You are certain of what you heard?" Judge Stone asked Oliver. He nodded. He said he'd tell everyone what really happened the night Mom ended up in the chair. Judge Stone turned to Adrian. "What exactly did you intend to reveal?" "Your Honor, my client was under emotional strain," Blake said. She didn't look at him. "Mr. Blackwell." Adrian's lips moved. No words came. Priya stood. The statement connects directly to the crash evidence, the recent attempt to question Ms. Whitmore's memory, and Mr. Blackwell's effort to pressure her into surrendering custody, in a courthouse hallway, in front of his son. Blake objected. Overruled. Judge Stone asked one question. "You left this child's daily life for 10 years. Now, after he receives public recognition and you learn about his education trust, you seek custody, control over his school, and influence over his financial future. So I am asking you plainly, why now?" Adrian looked around the room. At Sloane, at Oliver, at me. For once, there was no perfect sentence. "I wanted a chance," he said. "I believe you wanted one," Judge Stone said. "I am not convinced you understood that a chance is not the same thing as control." She ruled that afternoon. Primary custody remained with me. Adrian's petition was denied. His visitation was suspended pending review, to resume only through therapeutic supervision, if Oliver agreed. He was barred from contacting Oliver outside approved channels. The Education Trust stayed under my sole management. The crash-related evidence was referred for further review. Then she looked at him directly. "Parenthood is presence, Mr. Blackwell. It cannot be reconstructed in court." Adrian didn't look at Oliver on his way out. That told me more than the ruling did. Sloane lingered by the door. For a second, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she whispered, "You ruined us." "No," Celeste said quietly, stepping beside me. "He just ran out of lies." Outside, the air smelled like rain on hot pavement. Oliver walked beside my chair without touching it. He knew I'd ask if I needed help. At the ramp, he stopped. "Mom, Are you okay? I thought about the hospital, the blue folder, the missed birthdays, the trust, the old text message, the hallway video, the way Adrian had looked when every clean sentence finally ran out. No, I said honestly, but I'm free. He nodded like that made sense. Can we go home? Bolt needs new wheels. I laughed. It surprised us both. The months after court were not simple, but they were quieter. Adrian did not go to prison. Life is rarely that neat. But the trust issue damaged his credibility. The crash evidence was referred for review, not straight to a criminal court, and for the first time, his perfect story stopped protecting him. Word travels in the small, polished world Adrian worked in, the kind of world where a man's reputation is half his collateral. 2 of his investors quietly pulled out of a development deal that fall. Nobody connected it to the custody case out loud. Nobody had to. Oliver started therapy that September, once a week, with a counselor who specialized in kids caught between divorced parents. He didn't always want to go. Some weeks he came home and told me nothing. Other weeks he came home and told me everything. All at once, like a faucet finally turned all the way open. She asked if I feel responsible for you, he said one evening, doing homework at the kitchen table. What did you say? I said I used to. Not anymore. Mostly. He didn't look up from his worksheet. She says mostly is honest. Honest is good. I started therapy too. On Tuesdays, in an office 2 floors above a dry cleaner. I hadn't done that in the 10 years since the accident. There had never seemed to be room for it, between rehabilitation and rent and being the parent who showed up. My therapist asked me, in our second session, why I'd waited so long. Because somebody had to be fine, I said. You don't have to be fine anymore. It took me longer than I expected to believe her. Life did not become simple. Adrian's visitation stayed suspended through the winter, then resumed in the spring through a therapeutic supervisor, twice a month, an hour at a time, in a beige room with a box of tissues and a clock Oliver could see from his chair. He came home quiet, most weeks, but not frightened. Slowly, the quiet started to look less like fear and more like a boy deciding, on his own terms, how much of his father he wanted to let back in. It was not the ending I would have written for him, but it was his to write, not mine, and for the first time in a decade, nobody was rewriting it for either of us. One day, a letter came through the supervised communication system, unopened, in Oliver's hand. Do I have to read it? No. Can you? Yes. I opened it. Oliver, I am sorry things became so complicated. I handled some things badly. I hope one day you understand I wanted what I thought was best for you. I stopped there. Is it bad? It's not really an apology. I thought so. I folded the letter. Maybe someday he'll say sorry without explaining why, Oliver said. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. That was no longer the center of our lives. On my 40th birthday, he gave me a small wrapped box, a keychain shaped like a tiny ramp, made on the 3D printer at school. On the back, one engraved sentence, "You never held me back." I held it in my palm for a long time. You know, when you were little, I was afraid you'd think I trapped you. Mom, he frowned. You were the door. Adrian had tried to crop me out of the story. He'd tried to buy a bedroom, hire an expert, question my memory, and disguise control as concern. But he could not fake the years he was absent. He left when I could not stand. He came back when our sun began to shine. And by then, Oliver already knew the difference between a man who wanted credit and a parent who had stayed. When the truth finally entered the room, it did not need help standing.